Think of Rome, and you might think of the Vatican. Think of the Vatican, and you might think of the Sistine Chapel. Think of the Sistine Chapel, and you probably think of Michelangelo. But he was far more than a painter. Michelangelo, the greatest artist of the Renaissance, was truly a Renaissance man. A sculptor, a poet, and in his final years, primarily an architect.
Part of the transformation of the Rome we know today is because of Michelangelo's architectural projects in the late 70s and 80s of his life.
And his biggest project of all was at the Vatican. But it wasn't the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. It was St. Peter's Basilica.
At 70, deserves to retire. And the Pope comes and says, you're taking over St. Peter's, the largest, most complicated architectural project in the world. Michelangelo just can't believe it. He's 70 years old. He has no business taking over such a project. But you do not say no to a pope.
And William Wallace just can't seem to say no to Michelangelo. Dr. Wallace is a professor of art history at Washington University and an internationally recognized authority on Michelangelo, whose 7th book about the artist, called Michelangelo, God's Architect, tells the story of the artist's final years and greatest masterpiece.
If you ask who's the greatest engineer of the Renaissance, everybody would say Leonardo da Vinci. We have 6,000 pages of Leonardo's drawings and all kinds of brilliant engineering ideas. But Leonardo didn't actually carry out any of those engineering ideas. Michelangelo just did it. He didn't talk about it, he didn't draw it, he just did it.
Michelangelo knew he would never live long enough to see St. Peter's completed. But despite new problems and old age, he persevered, because Michelangelo was never building St. Peter's for himself.
Well, as he said, he ended up working for God. At the end, he was no longer working for his friends or his family. The person he was working for was God. He was God's architect.
William Wallace, thanks very much for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
I'm always curious about authors who write about figures that, have been known figures, historic figures for hundreds of years. How do you find something left to say?
Well, it's a very good question, and it's the right question, I think, to ask. I think the truth is that the great people of the past deserve to be looked at periodically by every generation. There's something always new to find out because there are always new questions. I think every generation asks new questions. We didn't ask the same kinds of questions about Michelangelo 100 years ago that we ask today. We want to know more about his personal life. We want to know much more about who he was, who his friends were, how did he live, and those are the kinds of things that I've really spent a lot of time involving myself, looking at the documents, looking at his life.
Well, I suppose one advantage you would have with Michelangelo is that he lived sort of double the expected lifetime of his day, living to almost 89.
Exactly right. The average age was 40 to 45 in the Renaissance. He started dying at age 40 and did it for about 50 years. So yes, he almost lived to 90.
I imagine that meant there was a lot more material to go through and a lot more material perhaps left to cover?
Well, yes, because he lived a long life, and he was probably the best documented artist before the 19th century. We have an immense amount of documentation about Michelangelo. And the other part of this story, I think, Paul, is that we are very much interested in the heroic early Michelangelo, the carver of the David, the carver of the Pietà, the painter of the Sistine, all of which happened in the first third of his life. And that's the story that's been told over and over and over again, 100 times in 100 books. The late life is the part that I'm telling now in this new and most recent book, his 70s and his 80s. And I'd like to maintain that they are actually the busiest time of his life and his most creative.
Certainly one of the most interesting.
Well, but unfamiliar to most of an American audience. It's the Michelangelo who is the builder of Rome, essentially the transformer of Rome into Baroque Rome that we know, and especially the builder of St. Peter's, which is not many people have visited St. Peter's, but are not completely aware of the fact that that is the great masterpiece of Michelangelo.
Guilty.
Oh,
right
well,
here.
well,
Three times.
That's quite all right.
It never really even registered with me,
That's
except for,
quite
of course,
all right.
the Sistine Chapel.
But there's a good reason there, because it took 150 years to build St. Peter's, and Michelangelo only devoted 18 years of his life to it. But he gave the stamp that made that building, and that building is Michelangelo's.
Well, and he also wasn't the original architect.
That's right. That's right. And he followed much of that original architect's original plan. He realized that that original plan was a good plan, but it had gotten messed up in the 40 years before Michelangelo took it over. And that's one of the things he had to do, was straighten out a big mess when he took it over.
He did so at the request of the Pope. He wasn't looking for that sort of work, right?
A request, you might say it's a request. When the Pope says you're going to take over St. Peter's, you don't say no to the Pope. It wasn't exactly the request that Michelangelo wanted to hear at age 70.
We tend to think of Michelangelo as a sculptor, as a painter. I don't think many people think of him as an architect, which is obviously one of the things that we learned from your book, but the other is that he was quite a poet.
Sculptor, painter, architect, engineer, and poet, and that's something that almost nobody knows about, and it's so very rare in the history of art. There's only one other artist in the whole history of art who's equally important as a writer as also as a visual artist, and that's William Blake, who is studied in English writing classes and also studied in art history. And the same is true of Michelangelo. In Italian literature classes, Michelangelo's poetry is extremely important, and an extremely important contribution to Italian literature. But much of Michelangelo's poetry is very difficult and very inaccessible, I would say, to an American audience. Although it's been translated over and over again. William Wordsworth was one of the early translators of Michelangelo's poetry, and there have been a long succession of people translating. But even so, it's a very, very dense and interesting and important part of his activity that is an important part of the story that has not been well incorporated into Michelangelo's life.
Was it unusual for artists to be architects as well, or at that time was everybody sort of doing everything? The Renaissance man and the Renaissance, so to speak?
No, actually it was not unusual. There was not yet an architectural profession, really, and architects were trained as artists. Artists were the ones who knew how to draw, how to draft, how to use paper and pencil, basically, and to build models. So the architects really came out of being artists. So Michelangelo came out of a usual profession. But it was unusual to become an architect at age 40, which is what Michelangelo did, because up until age 40 he was carving sculpture and painting the Sistine ceiling, and he had really no training in architecture at all. And suddenly he takes up architecture at age 40, like he took up poetry at age 50. And he takes up these things and becomes one of the most important architects of all time. And in fact, I would say probably Michelangelo's architecture was more influential on later subsequent centuries than any of his painting and sculpture. People who try to imitate Michelangelo's sculpture are pretty bad artists.
Or brave.
Or very brave, but oftentimes failed.
But you would have to have some sort of engineering understanding or something, right? Because, I mean, he was redesigning all of the elements of it, not just the pretty parts.
Well, this is another part of the facet of Michelangelo that I've spent a lot of time sort of excavating and repurposing. Michelangelo the Engineer. We think of Leonardo da Vinci. If you ask who's the greatest engineer of the Renaissance, everybody would say Leonardo da Vinci. We have 6,000 pages of Leonardo's drawings and all kinds of brilliant engineering ideas. But Leonardo didn't actually carry out any of those engineering ideas. Michelangelo just did it. He didn't talk about it, he didn't draw it, he just did it. And he accomplished enormously complicated and impressive engineering feats all through his life. So he had an engineering skill and knowledge that was of a depth beyond anybody else of his time. And it started with the fact that he was a sculptor. He was bringing marble blocks from the Carrara quarries 90 miles from Carrara to Florence. And these were blocks that are 8 tons, larger than anything that had been moved since Roman times 1,000 years before. So he had to rethink how the Romans had done this and how they had transported these materials, how they lifted 8 tons and moved them 90 miles. So that was the beginning of his engineering knowledge, which helps, of course, in building a building.
Well, you talk about, too, using the donkeys to haul these things and this kind of system that he arranged around with ramps and so forth to get the donkeys to haul that up there.
This was a brilliant innovation in St. Peter's. We don't actually know unless you climb the dome in St. Peter's, because you climb the dome and come down one of these helical ramps. There are 4 of them in the corners of the dome. And these are enclosed ramps, circular helical ramps that go up. And these were designed by Michelangelo so that he could carry the materials, the building materials, sand, bricks, water, and the stone, up 200 or 250 feet. And the donkeys were carrying these up these ramps. And of course, if the donkeys knew they were 250 feet up in the air, they would have frozen and they wouldn't have moved. But inside these helical ramps, they were very comfortable and they were very easy to carry these heavy, heavy weights up. So this is one of these brilliant innovations that Michelangelo came up with.
Well, and of all the parts of St. Peter's that people would picture, I think, when they first picture St. Peter's in their mind, at least, is the dome.
The dome.
Which was a significant contribution. You point out in the book that not only was that the crowning contribution, so to speak, at St. Peter's, but that it kind of changed the landscape of Rome from a city of bell towers to a city of domes.
It's a very nice way to put it. Yes, it's exactly right. When we look over the landscape of Rome, it is the dome of St. Peter's that dominates our whole vision of the city. And it's the dome that gets imitated over and over again for the next 200 or 300 years. St. Paul's in London, dome after dome after dome, modeled on St. Peter's. The sad thing is, of course, Paul, is that Michelangelo never saw that dome completed. And this is the great, I think, maybe something of the tragedy of Michelangelo's late life. I mean, he lived to 89 years, but not quite long enough to see that dome completed. And this is I think, not really a tragedy, because it's a miracle, really, that he knew what that dome was going to be. And not to be able to live long enough to see your greatest masterpiece completed is really kind of a sad thing, I think.
Yeah, that raises an interesting question that I thought about just sitting here talking about it when you mentioned that, is that, for instance, Eros Saarinen died before the arch was built. But he probably had the expectation that he would live to see it built. Michelangelo didn't really think that he would ever see all of St. Peter's built. It would have taken too long.
No, that's very true. That's a very nice parallel. I like that. And look at Saarinen's arch. What a monument it is. And we immediately associate the arch with Saarinen and its completion. And I think we should do the same with Michelangelo's dome. Some people complain, well, Michelangelo would have changed his mind and the dome isn't exactly what we expect. Yes, he probably did change. He changed his mind every single day. Every single day when on the architectural site, he changed his mind. But the dome is the dome that he basically designed, and he would have been perfectly, I think, content to see it rise all the way to what we have today.
I don't know if you could say he was the first multitasker, but he was certainly a multitasker.
He was a multitasker par excellence.
What all was he working on at the same time that he was working on St. Peter's?
Well, St. Peter's was the dominant one, but he's the architect to the Pope. So he's working on 6 different architectural sites around Rome. And they are not quite as large as St. Peter's, but they are all gigantic projects. The Porta Pia, one of the gates of Rome, Santa Maria degli Angeli, one of the great bath complexes, a Roman bath complex that he transforms from a pagan temple or a pagan bath complex into a Christian church. He's designing the Farnese Palace. He's redesigning sort of the streets of Rome. So he's really become an urban designer, and really part of the transformation of the Rome we know today is because of Michelangelo's architectural projects in the late 70s and 80s of his life.
Was the Sistine Chapel in danger of being torn down as part of redoing St. Peter's?
One of the plans in the 40 years before Michelangelo took over St. Peter's, one of the plans for the building was to let's expand the building even larger than what we were planning, what Bramante, the original architect, had in mind. Let's expand it really large. And this, of course, was the competitor, one of the competitors of Michelangelo. He was going to expand it so large that the Sistine Chapel would get eradicated. And we'd just lose the Sistine and everything that Michelangelo ever painted.
Wow.
Wow is a good thing that
good
he
thing
died.
He took it over, yeah.
He died just in time, 1545, that architect. And he wasn't a very good architect.
Apparently not. What did Michelangelo think of himself as primarily?
A sculptor. Yeah, absolutely a sculptor. I think he always imagined himself as a sculptor, and he thought of architecture sculpturally. When he took over St. Peter's, he took over 40 years of building, and it was already a mess. And so how does he go about taking a look at this mess and figuring out what to do with it? He looked at it as a sculpture. And as a sculptor, he always looked at a block and looked towards the torso. Here's what is the important part of the body. And everything else is just appendage. So he looks at St. Peter's and he looks to the torso of St. Peter's. And the plan, the original plan that you pointed out, the original architect had a good plan. The plan was good, and then what Michelangelo adds to that plan is scale and proportion. Michelangelo changed his mind every single day on site.
Must have been fun to work there.
I think he was difficult to work for, but one of the remarkable things that I really admire about him is the loyalty that he instilled in a number of people, and people who worked with him for 10, 20, and 30 years, and people who really truly understood what he was up to and what he wanted to do and accomplish, which is why the building was completed according to Michelangelo's design, even after his death.
Was he that way with all his art? I know from reading the book that there was a lot of art that was unfinished because he just couldn't make up his mind what he wanted to do with it.
There's a lot of incomplete sculptures. More than half of his sculptures are actually incomplete. And one of the stunning things is that nobody ever decided to touch them even after Michelangelo's death. What people decided to do was either like them as unfinished works, and people even today go into the academia to admire the wonderful David. But many people come away thinking, but how about those unfinished sculptures before the David? There are 4 or 5 of them lining the corridor there before the David. Those are the works that most people talk about as the most admirable because they're seeing Michelangelo at work. So, in fact, Michelangelo sort of transformed the way that we even appreciate sculpture, that something unfinished could be as much admired as a completely, perfectly finished work of art as the David.
You had to spend a good deal of time in Rome researching this and looking out at St. Peter's. That must have been awful, terrible duty.
I'd be there now, Paul, if it wasn't for the COVID. Right now, there's been 2 years in a row that I haven't been to Italy, and largely just because of the pandemic. But yes, the nice thing about teaching at Washington University is I have my summers free, and that's my laboratory. So I think of Italy as my laboratory. It's where I do my research and much of my writing.
Well, they have quite a school of architecture at Washington University. Have you consulted with them in particular about this topic because of the architectural nature of it?
Well, I love teaching architects. I've taught architecture, and I've taught Michelangelo, and I love having the architects in because they have their own particular way of looking at things. Sure, yes, I talk to architects all the time. I think they have a very, very neat viewpoint on the world.
He lived a very long time, as we've said, twice as long probably as the average person at the time. You'd think that would be a wonderful thing, but I got the impression it was really a very sad thing for him.
Well, sad in one sense that he outlived all the people that were most important to him, including his family. And this is another thing that's quite new, I think, to Michelangelo's studies, is we always talk of Michelangelo as a loner, and this comes from The Agony and the Ecstasy, the great popular book by Irving Stone, that Michelangelo didn't get along with anybody, and he particularly didn't get along with his family. But that's really really not quite true. He was very close to his family. He had 5 brothers, and he outlived every one of them. And this is a very sad part of the story. As he watched his family, he was very, very concerned about the continuation of the Buonarroti family. He was very invested in the idea of his family continuing on beyond him, because he did not marry, he did not have children, and only one of his brothers ever married and had children. And so he was very concerned about those people continuing on the family name. So outliving all of those people, his father and his brothers, and then some of his best friends, dying much younger because the average age was so much younger than 89. And I think that is a very sad part of the story. But the positive part of the story is that he had these friends that really meant a huge amount to him and that really kept him, I think, alive and creative and working well into his 80s.
And having lost so many, I guess it gave him more of an incentive to continue working to keep himself busy.
Well, as he said, he ended up working for God. At the end, he was no longer working for his friends or his family. The person he was working for was God. He was God's architect, and he really believed that.
Was he nervous at all about taking on this job, or reluctant about taking on the job of St. Peter's?
More than reluctant. I mean, can you imagine? At age 70, he had just completed the worst project in his life, the 40-year albatross that had been hanging around his neck, the Julius tomb. And he finally has this project completed and off of his chest. And he hasn't been back to his family or to his hometown in some 20 years. And at 70, he's deserves to retire. And the Pope comes and says, "You're taking over St. Peter's, the largest, most complicated architectural project in the world." And Michelangelo just can't believe it. He's 70 years old. He has no business taking over such a project. So yes, the reluctance was so deep, so long, it's hard to believe. But as I said, you do not say no to a pope. But I think that conversation, I sort of reimagined it in the book, but it has to be imagined what that conversation must have been like between a pope that just says, "You're doing this," and a Michelangelo who has 1,000 reasons why this is not a good idea.
If you had the opportunity to talk to him, what would you want to know more than anything else?
Well, I don't think he would probably answer truthfully anyway. He was very close. It takes a long time for him to accept you as a friend, I think. I mean, while I say he had very, very close friends, you had to earn his trust. You had to earn his trust. And so if I just quickly asked him some kind of personal question, I think I wouldn't get very much of an answer. But what would I want to ask? That's a wonderful question. Well, I'd probably want to ask, about some of his closest friends, his most personal relationships. The closest friends, I think, in Rome were Vittoria Colonna, the great lady poetess, and then the young Tommaso de Cavalieri, whom he literally just really fell in love with, but who was some 25 or 30 years younger than he was. And what was the nature of that relationship? But of course, that would be something that he would surely not tell you very much about.
Maybe that's what kept him living to 89.
Well, and yes, and they stayed friends through all through Michelangelo's life. Tommaso de Cavalieri is one who did not die on Michelangelo and was at his deathbed at the end, even though he got married and ended up becoming a very important Roman citizen.
Rome was kind of a wild place back then. I had no idea. It was like the Las Vegas of
Well, yes, it was turning into the Baroque Rome of the popes that sort of solidified the reputation of Rome as the center of the Christian world. But you're right, it was kind of a wild place, and you might be thinking about when each of the popes died, and Michelangelo outlived 9 popes. And as each pope died, the city went into chaos. People ransacked the papal palaces and stole everything from the families of the popes, and oftentimes it was several months before the new pope was elected, and so the city was clueless, lawless.
Did he feel at all, you think, that by working on St. Peter's, that he was working on something that might bring some sort of religious or moral stability to Rome?
Yes. No, I think absolutely. And that's why I think it felt like he was working for God, that he really felt that this was the one thing in his life that he could do, not only to save his own soul, but to reestablish the morality of the church. And of course, the church is under fire now at this time. Michelangelo lived through the Reformation, Luther's, breaking away from the church, and so the church is under attack by half of the world, the Protestant world. And the idea of the church as a moral authority, St. Peter's gives the church a center, and really St. Peter's is the center of the Catholic Christendom.
Has any of his work at St. Peter's been changed or altered since his death, or since it was completed initially?
Well, even in his lifetime, remember in the Last Judgment, people complained about the nudity in the Last Judgment, and there was a lot of controversy there. What are we doing? This is the papal chapel. Why are there all these nudes? Well, of course, it's the Last Judgment, and we're all going to be nude before God at the moment. But people did object, and people started painting draperies over these figures, and Michelangelo just said, if you need to paint draperies over them, go ahead. And so, yes, things were changed even in his lifetime.
That's the last reaction I would have guessed he would have had.
No, but I think it shows the depth of he was not doing it for himself. He's painting the Last Judgment for God, and it's the Last Judgment. And if you think on earth that you somehow need to know what the Last Judgment's about, go ahead, paint it the way you think it is. But it was one of his pupils who did the initial painting of draperies. More draperies were painted on later in different times. We've gone through various periods of morality, more conservative and less conservative. And that was one of the most interesting moments in my life, quite honestly, in 1980-90, when they started the conservation of the Sistine ceiling. After the ceiling was completed and finished, they started on the Last Judgment to clean it. And they had to decide how many of these draperies are they going to take off. And they took off a bunch, certainly many of the later ones. But some of the ones that were done in Michelangelo's lifetime were actually painted in fresco. So they had dug out the old paint and put it in new plaster. So those could not be altered.
Are you done with Michelangelo, or have you got another book coming?
No, I said no, I am not done. I keep thinking I'm done, but no, I'm writing a book on Michelangelo and Titian, who lived almost as long as Michelangelo did. They overlapped for 40 years, and they paid attention to each other. Titian is a Venetian, and they're always sort of competing each other. Venetians are always competing with Florentines, and they had a very long and intense sort of distant rivalry. And so this is a very interesting sort of 40-year relationship.
Sounds interesting. I hope you'll come back and see us when that book comes out.
Well, thank you. I hope that I live long enough to finish it.
Just like Michelangelo.
They'll keep me young.
William Wallace, thanks so much for a fascinating conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. How many persons die before completing their life's most important work? Michelangelo was painfully aware that his final project was yet another unfinished work. But while his life's journey was ending, his greatest masterpiece was just coming into being. St. Peter's is his crowning achievement, as well as the most prominent symbol of papal authority and the universal church. While the artist is not buried there, the church is, in many respects, the artist's lasting memorial.